Good afternoon and welcome back to the fourth and final day of our Nasher Prize Graduate Symposium, dedicated to the work of our 2022 Laureate Nairy Baghramian, whom we just saw in a new video filmed during her visit to the Nasher last month. I'm Catherine Kraft, curator at the Nasher Sculpture Center. It's my pleasure to be moderating these proceedings. Today we'll begin with a roundtable discussion involving our student presenters, followed by a keynote address at the top of the hour from Professor Miwon Kwon. Over the previous 3 days, we've heard 5 excellent, thought-provoking papers that delved into a number of concepts related to Baghramian's work. And I think we're all by this point seeing resonances and connections between the ideas and artworks discussed by individual participants with a number of intersections and consistent themes. Before we begin our discussion, I'd like to raise a few of these themes, these keynote keywords, if you will, to bring them to the table as possible points of departure for questions. We've considered the mediation of sculpture by photography, presence and becoming in different contexts, the body and gender, the relation between art and traditions of pedagogy, abstraction's potential for political and social response, and art's engagement with institutional spaces. To start, I'd like to reintroduce our speakers. And maybe you can just give a wave when I call out your names. Inji Kim.
Hi.
Hello. India Picton. Camila Matola.
Hi.
Jana Labraska. And Frederick Cruz Noel.
Thank you. Hello.
We're going to start by talking among ourselves, but I'd like to invite everyone watching to contribute questions. I can't see them directly. They're actually being relayed to me as we go along, and then I pass them on to our speakers. And I think there have been a few from the previous day's proceedings that we weren't able to get to. So if you'd like to resubmit those or rephrase them for the whole group, please do so. But I'll start first with just a question from me. It's been on my mind since the first day, and that is, Inji introduced the issue of photography into her talk, and I do want to return to it. And of course, we all rely on images of artwork in our research, but the pandemic has really intensified this phenomenon. And it's especially pointed when we deal with an artist like Nairy Baghramian, who is creating sculptures that are often placed in response to specific sites. Baghramian's work often deals with the political and social implications of spaces and who has access to certain types of spaces. Through photography, for example, we not only see misfits in Milan, we have, as it were, full visual access to works that are otherwise restricted to certain types of viewers. And again, this experience of photography for research is not unique, but I think Baghramian's work may offer some insights into how we negotiate this tension between what is virtual and what is experienced with and through our bodies in a specific space. Baghramian does use photography in her own practice. If you think of Jumbled Alphabets, the portrait that occurs in Misfits, but it's difficult to know really how actively she participates in the installation photography of her work. But to bring it back to us and what's been going on this week, how might we think about the relation between her objects in installation in specific spaces, their photographic documentation, and her recurring use of photographs in her installations? And I can just open it to whoever would like to go first, or I can kind of go around to each of you so we all have a chance. Inji, would you like to start, since you were introducing kind of this theme in our first conversation?
Yeah, sure. I'm very excited to hear about what everyone else has to say about this, because for me, it really, well, like, I think like as a nascent kind of scholar, interacting with digital images or images in print, which are also, I think, in certain ways very different, has been like a fascinating topic, because sometimes like the issue of even like access to a certain image can like give priority to a certain artwork over another. So I thought I've been just kind of really interested in the hierarchy of imaging and how that really shapes scholarship overall. But in context of Baghramian's work, I was really also interested in the performativity of sculpture in her images, because I briefly mentioned this during the Q&A session of my talk, but I thought I was really interested in how images give new order and new meaning to works within themselves beyond the institutional context that Baghramian often engages with. So I thought like the expansion of her, like the conceptual dimensions of her work are very evident in looking at the photography of her work, which was quite fascinating for me. And it really kind of raised a lot of questions about how I can use a similar approach in other artists' works as well.
Can you say a little bit more about that, just specifically, like an example and
yeah, so
work?
Scruff of, and I think this is really, it hinges upon the fact that the Formation Professionnelle was this revisitation and a deconstruction of what a retrospective is supposed to be. So for those who are not familiar with what this is, she basically, instead of doing a traditional retrospective, decided to revisit her previous works and either respond or create new works or change some of the works that she did in the past. And in that process, we were able to see how she chose to change certain elements of her work very clearly. But if a viewer was visiting this exhibition without previous context about her other works, obviously they're just seeing this as like what it is, face value. So to see, like, for example, like Scruff of the Neck, which was in a different form in an exhibition at Marion Goodman and was altered for the show for Deformation Professionnelle, like you could really see how internally these works have a very specific dynamic that is not evident in physical sight. And the juxtaposition of the two photographs in the publication of this exhibition were fascinating to me, because I was like, oh, like it really kind of brings forward the logic that she grants to these artworks and their relations that are quite transcendent beyond the immediate space and what she was trying to do in that specific exhibition.
Jana, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of jump onto what Inji was saying. I think one of the things, Inji, that you did so well in your paper was talking about kind of asking us to slow down and consider, art history is predicated in some ways on the circulation of photographs of artworks. And you're in your paper, you were asking us to kind of slow down and consider what it is, the photograph, especially when it's documenting something, is presumed to be transparent. And, what's really, I think, interesting, and I'd really like to hear from you a little bit more, because I think you mentioned that you wanted to stay focused on the photography of the sculpture in your paper. But one of the things that I struggled with in getting to know Baghramian's work in the way that I have through this process of research, not seeing it in person and getting what I could get online, was that I really found it difficult to understand how her actual use of photography was working in her practice and in the shows. There's the reproduction of the photograph on the t-shirt for the guard. There's the flag being flown outside the venue. So, I mean, there's a really, I think, interesting flip there where it's like, yes, we have, you know, these works that have been, I would say, photographed in general expertly to convey what they look and might feel like in the space. But then we have this other use of photography that is kind of maybe designed to be more difficult to transmit across distances. So I'd love to hear if, you know, in your research, it kind of ended up on the cutting room floor or something, if you have any kind of additional thoughts about the role of photography within the scope of her practice, not just as documentation.
So it's actually interesting because when I read your paper, I actually had this interesting not a breakthrough, but you talk about kind of the need to clear space, right? And to kind of have this almost like absent state that's not charged to kind of really like as like a clearing session. And I thought like at least the documentations of her work actually fulfill that function to a certain degree because it kind of is in this very constructed form. And to answer your question about how she uses photography within, I thought it was really interesting that when I was writing about one of her work, it's actually really hard to find like photographs of her photographic work sometimes, which I thought was really interesting and entertaining to a certain degree, because I thought it was almost like this subversion of like photography as a medium. But to me, the way she uses photography is like this very, I think she's like highly aware of what photography can do, especially in conversation with sculpture, because but also in a very like institutional context, because a lot of the photography that she uses are mostly very, very aware of each exhibition's context, I've realized, and also is used as an activation of space and body to like put photography on someone's like t-shirt or taking photographs of an interior space and blowing it up. Like I thought like it's almost like photography is almost like this medium to really create like a charged response to different contexts, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I would argue that it's also kind of like leaving something left over that can't, it's articulating all that it can't show you. It's, you know, it's like leaving something for the person who does make it to the show and sees how it's functioning, and maybe it's ambiguous, and that's like, you know, something that I think can be productive.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
I also wanted to check in. I mentioned misfits in my kind of opening question, and so I wanted to check in with India and Frederick about how they used the documentation and photography within the misfits that they discussed in their papers.
Yeah,
I can.
so,
Okay.
Go ahead, India. That's
It
okay.
happened.
no, I was just thinking just then, it kind of came up accidentally in that the kind of the ideas of Deleuze I was looking at is it's so pinned on having a literal molecular exchange with another. And so yeah, I showed my mum that presentation. She was like, you need to have a video in it if you're going to talk about the children playing, because people need to see what you mean. And I hadn't even looked properly at the video until that point. So yeah, I was literally just getting it through entirely images, and trying to also say that we need to be close to each other. And so I don't know, I think maybe it's good to look at photography as maybe just another layer of how we already are limited in accessing these sculptures, whether it's via other means that we're not fully able to access it, whether it's to describe it to each other as to limit it of its what it's trying to say. And then I was thinking about Jana saying about, kind of the ambiguity of them and the openness to the future of where they're going to be, and her kind of interest in the future of the work and the incorporation of that into the making of the sculpture itself. And so then it's just all these, you're right, there's a tension, and I'm not really sure where the tension is, because there's that where you feel like you need to be next to it to experience it. But then thinking about kind of photography at large and how we experience it and how it's used to kind of train us in the same way that it might be an object lesson or something. It trains us who to feel sympathy for in the media, or who to not feel sympathy for. So then in that way, maybe we're kind of just too far gone to ever get something through photos. But yeah, I'm not quite sure, but I think what you guys were saying just then about the incorporation of it into the making process seems to be key, in that maybe always when we're making now, we're always thinking about, maybe not even just Nairy, about where it's going to be and how it's going to be. If it's moving around galleries, then it must also be prepared to be photographed in the same way, I guess.
Thank you for sharing. I like the anecdote that you provided about your mom in the video, because that made me really get a different window, because my window into the same exhibition was quite different, which was great. And I appreciated what you made me think about in the revelations, some connections that I wasn't thinking about from other places. But I'm the giant head cheese that has seen Nairy Baghramian's work in many exhibition contexts, but I have chosen to focus for this endeavor on the one that I have not seen, which I did not think about. So Catherine, thank you for presenting that question. I might make that a more productive opening to the essay that I will eventually provide. But I saw an image, presumably on an efflux circular online, and it was the image of misfits in Milano, and it was they look like pastel fingerling potatoes, and it's this neoclassical periwinkle. I don't know if it's a ballroom or it's not a sitting room, probably some kind of grand room. And I click, and so I clicked on it, and then I read the discursive text for the exhibition, and it brought to my attention that these works were conceived with toys that I had encountered through thinking of the relationship between early 20th century German modern artists playing with activity toys. They're the kiddie toys. And that image doesn't give you that impression immediately. However, the image for Marion Goodman Gallery that was, I don't know, say simultaneous, but that was also happening, I like that word, that was in Paris, does give you that image immediately. And it's a different architecture structure. So that would allude more white cube, that kind of geometry. And so I went back and I looked at the beautiful photographs that are on the website. And I don't know if I was seeing the material presumably after the exhibition had opened. And there was the information provided, the nugget that was in this Italian estate. It was an English garden of which you could presumably imagine a situation where this is true, neoclassical architecture, where you could only be in this garden with a child. And that's a different architectural substructure of Western aesthetics, of classicism, right? You've got your cube, and then you've got your Vitruvian cube, which are cubes of a kind. And it really got me thinking about what's going on here because I took the bait. So I think that that's how they work for me. I take the bait, and I think that if one is of the presumed persuasion to look at a palatial estate and say, that's not for me, you wouldn't take the bait. So they worked on me, and I'm glad it did. But again, I have not seen this work. So I guess that would be on me.
I was just thinking as well, when I was watching the video of Nairy talking at the beginning about listening to sculptures, it was when I was thinking yesterday when I was watching your presentation, Frederick, and thinking about sound. I've been thinking about sound a lot recently, and kind of the way you can in certain ways not photograph sound, obviously that's light, but you can image sound, and you can have echolocation, and that's how animals communicate with each other. And then I was remembering they have, I don't know if they're quite synthesizers, but you can hook up to plants and you can hear them now. And I was thinking you could hook one up to one of the sculptures maybe and see what they have to say for themselves. It could be an interesting experiment to do. But then it's just, there's always one layer of modulation between the object and us, I guess, whether it's listening or it's how you do that listening, I guess, which made me think about the photography as well.
I like that you were thinking about like attaching something to amplify a potential sense object that would be occurring like in an environment, because a part of what I did not necessarily articulate eloquently yesterday was that I have an interest in as well in people that have aesthetic worldviews built upon the idea that a wave contains light, color, sound. It can be extraordinarily metaphysical. And when you're in a world of zeros and ones in a different condition in like the digital age, that's a different position as well. But in this context, I think that is very not what they would have done, because I think the sound would have been there already. So it's not a sound that you would like hear or amplify. It would be like an inner sound. And when I was listening to the listening, I remembered a really corny joke that sometimes I'll tell to like as like an icebreaker. And it'll be like, well, imagine you're like, see yourself seeing, for like students that don't want to open up. Like, see, what does that look like? See yourself seeing. You can kind of see yourself watching TV or whatever you do. And if you say, well, how do you listen to yourself listening? People get like stomped, except for the two people that have like tinnitus, right? So it's not so deep all the time when we exchange the registers. So that would be like not the psychoanalytic frame of listening for like an inner voice or something inner. It's, I like that sometimes they're surface arrangements. So what I would listen to Nairy sculptures, and perhaps I do, thinking about harmony obsessively, that I'm not listening for a material affective kind of material object, like listening to how it positions the senses in this beaux arts box.
I think if we think about the video of Misfits that India showed, I think one of the things that, of course, video in this case, or photography, does is that it allows us to kind of connect between these two spaces and to see things that we wouldn't necessarily be able to see if we were there ourselves. And of course, the connections that we're able to make between these two forms of sculpture, the aluminum objects inside and the marble objects outside, that look like they should fit together, but they don't actually. You need to be able to see both of them to make that connection. And presumably, if you're in the gallery, you can look out the window and see onto the terrace. And there's this wonderful image in the video of the kids who've been playing and jumping around on the marble sculptures, like looking into the gallery. And it's kind of unclear how much they can actually see. And one of the things, I'm maybe cheating a little bit here because I've talked to the artist about this. But one of the things that's been striking in conversations around this body of work is it's so focused on the children who can access or not access. And it's also kind of resting on a supposition that in prioritizing the child, that there is somebody, a caretaker, often kind of typically female, who is going to be able to be with them. And for the person in society who doesn't have a child, that experience is cut off. They're sort of cut off from that. And so I wanted to just, before leaving this behind, Camila, in your paper, you were talking about sort of social and political issues around some of Baghramian's work and questions of gender as well. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts about how photography, either as she uses it or as we use it to kind of access for work, if that has an effect on how you think about her work.
I think that one of the peculiar aspects of her work is the intersectional use of media. So in this case, also photography and sculptures together. As Inji was saying, this project, the curatorial project of Baghramian, are usually very complex, and so they just use different genres and different media to express different reflection about relationships between the object, photography or sculpture, with the institutional frame, how we perceive them. And yes, I think that is interesting seeing these works, these artworks, filtered by another medium again. So I think that maybe it is also part of her design to let us see and understand and also feel all these meanings, also social meanings, through these specular effect of all these media. And in photography, we are used to see social topics depicted in a figurative style. Baghramian, for what I've seen till now, uses also photography to reflect on agency in general. I think, for example, to the photographs of Fromage de Tête, where she builds a connection between the work of a cook and the work of an artist. They both need to confront themselves with the creative process, but at the same time they have to confront themselves with all the majoritarian relationship that India talk about. So yes, I think that photography also in her work depicts this, the general ambivalence of both the use of media and in relation with the space and with the curatorial main goal, and also of the relationship with all these unspoken meanings that are, yes, suggested, but not depicted as we are used to with a figurative style.
I really love what you pointed, like how you framed the figurative style, the style that was of many concerns in certain times. Because when I was looking initially at the children in Milan, I wasn't thinking in the contingency of the modernist cube. I was thinking cherub. And that you're bringing the attention to how certain figurative subjects are framed and presumptions you might bring retroactively into certain frames that are not of your time. Because I don't know, do you work with anything written? Is these like 17th century Western European paintings or something? That's not my background. But there was a lot of debates around angels and gender. And when angels no longer were the primordial androgen, it was a very, very avant-garde opinion in certain discourses centered around Sweden. So that also is another way to think about how we bind children to then liberate them within our own constructs, which is why I'm so drawn to how Nairy's work clearly is corroding some assumptions about modernisms, universalisms. So thank you.
This point, I think, is very interesting. You're right, Frederick, because as both of you, India and Frederick, highlighted, children are taught to understand some social and political structures through clear images, very explicit images. And I think that it is an aspect that it keeps getting back throughout centuries, through centuries. And what I think the artist points out is the fact that we can think we can reflect also on social relationships through different languages. We must not limit ourselves to the figurative language. Of course, figurative language has the quality of immediacy. So it gets to the point, it just hits the target. But at the same time, maybe this ambivalence, also ambivalence in the way she switches from a medium to another, is interesting because it just compels us to reflect more on how we speak about this relationship. How can we recognize them, and maybe abstraction in this case too. Even if she recurs to a more figurative style in photographs, but abstraction and figurative style too can be evidently through her work can be read in different levels.
I was just thinking as well. I don't know if it's a major point, but out of all the subjects you do get taught at school, practical art lessons are kind of the only ones which don't hold the photograph in its kind of force as in other subjects. I can remember kind of being taught to paint and wanting to paint from a picture on my phone, and everyone else in the class was wanting to paint from their phone. And every art teacher is like, no, you have to paint from the thing that's in front of you. You have to paint and there's life drawing classes, and it's kind of one of the only things now which really tries to maintain the power of the thing being there in front of you. And I don't know, maybe there is an age thing as well, kind of that, you have to convert something from 3D to 2D is something that you need to be kind of trained to do. It's not as simple as the light and shadow is kind of summed up in a way. But yeah, I just thought that was an interesting kind of thing I remembered about being taught to paint. Is it seems to be the last place that the object kind of is esteemed. Yeah.
That's so, especially considering your interest in like depth, like metaphors of depth, like that you're still getting the chiaroscuro technique. It's very fascinating. I think that also, I don't know how education works where you're from, how the liberal arts is still divided, but I always like to take the pulpit to announce that liberal arts education, it was not always jumbled the way that it is now, and particularly consequential for categories of artistic production that we're thinking about sometimes, I presume, or we have been this past week. In the medieval quadrivium, it was arithmetic, geometry, math, astronomy, music, right? That was all 4 paths to one task. And that task was philosophy, but it wasn't a discursive philosophy. It was a different kind of speculation. So that's, yeah, the chiaroscuro, like when did that become a metaphor for something beyond what could be represented in a more flat way? Like that's, I can, thank you for bringing that to my attention.
Of course, I wanted to say also that clear iconography is a safe ground. It's not possible to make mistake. But it's not new, the idea to think about abstraction as a vehicle of complex metaphor. But at the same time, at least in our field, it's not common to focus on abstraction as a vehicle of political messages, even if there are many scholar studies about, for example, eccentric abstraction attempt to vehicle political messages and through abstraction, of course. And yes, it is maybe it is a field that we have to investigate more nowadays. And Baghramian obviously highlights this point.
I love that. This is another pulpit issue for me. I will mute myself after this, but I was interested in pursuing discipline-specific musicological studies at the time that I was decided to do that, because my background would be in art theory and practice. And you're not having those discussions about how certain forms of abstraction are contingent upon a transcendental or an ineffable reception. And after killing myself dealing with Germans, you realize how particularly situated ineffability is to objects that you cannot see, that are musical in the context of a German imagination in the 18th and 19th century, revolving on a backwards projection around people like Beethoven. So that is something that I would love for everyone to talk about. So please, because unlike some discourses that I have and people in my field, sounds terrible, but it's almost remotely conceivable that you could write about Western art music as one person. It is not conceivable in art history to have, for at all. And there's so much that that is already, there's a claim agency over in the discourse that you don't have to deal with Beethoven, you don't have to deal with Cage, right? So like it's that kind of perspective that I just want to change the emoji to like party emoji.
Frederick, thanks for that, and Camila also. I'm just jumping in here to remind people. I think this conversation is becoming very absorbing for anybody watching it, though. Please feel free to add questions into the chat. And I just wanted to invite, because there were several places in the last few minutes of discussion, especially talking about abstraction and bodies and cherubs, where I was also thinking that I would love to hear what Jana thinks or might say in relation to that, given your paper about gender and bodies of sort of another sort.
Yeah, I mean, I also want to just like briefly push back a little bit on what Camila was saying about a perceived kind of dearth in scholarship on the political valences of abstraction, because I think that's that's been very heavily theorized and has so many kind of valences within history of modernism, within a history of sculpture. And I also wanted to just flag again what India was saying. The idea of the photograph as an object lesson is really, really interesting to me, particularly when it comes to questions of the pose and posing. But also, and just thinking about like this, the anecdote you were telling about being in art class and wanting to have that immediacy of the picture on your phone and the teacher kind of encouraging you to space that out. And I think as we've kind of been going through this conversation about Baghramian's use of the photograph, I think she's almost doing a similar kind of gesture with those images as she is with the objects, which is to really kind of take and stretch out that space of perception and make it much more robust, ambivalent. I've been like hearing this phrase going around of ambivalent abstraction and thinking about ambivalence. And I think I tried to communicate this in my paper, ambivalence as not something passive, but as really active and as a political position. I don't know very much about androgynous angels. I just loved to have that Bernini slide in there. But sorry, so those were like couple things I've had simmering on the back burner as we've been talking.
I did not remember. I was prepared. I was not being, that was not a read.
Oh no, I didn't take it as one. But I know I got a little bit of field of your question, Dr. Kraft. So can you tell me it again?
We can take it. I'm happy to go afield. I was just actually you did address it, I think.
Okay.
So I am also happy now. I mean, if yeah, go ahead, Frederick.
Just I'm wondering if just in terms of the scholarship that has, a sideways entryway into the way abstraction wields its power in certain frames. Are you talking, or is it David, is it the David Getsy perspective? Because I would also like to compartmentalize that kind of
I'm
freedom, because that's one,
yeah.
that's one perspective. And
I'm thinking about scholarship on Brazilian neoconcretism, for example, or,
it's extremely, I think, yes, those perspectives.
Or even scholarship coming out of a US context. I mean, in thinking about sort of like
Scott Burton, which would be very, I was actually thinking a lot about the relationship between Scott and Gordon's work. And when you were giving your presentation, not the angels part, I don't think, because I think I went to SIC for undergrad. And so there's some Scott Burton cubes everywhere you can sit on. And I really, I grew up thinking that was great, as an undergrad. And then recently in November, I reattended to that to see if I could, for another purpose. And I was kind of, okay, I guess this is taking a very particular approach to liberating abstraction for some reasons. It was like ethically utilizing a certain assumption of abstraction for something. And I was like, maybe I'll think about something else for this weekend. So that was brought to my attention. And with those can be very totalizing, I think, sometimes, because I don't always agree with what David Getsy says, personally.
I was just gonna say, I think what you were, then you said liberating, and then I think it's just remembering what you're liberating it from. And it's the fact that we're still trying, or not me particularly, but there's still an effort to liberate it and to create the scholarship on the power it has because of its kind of last 100 years of being so linked to the corporate environment, and being that kind of ambivalence is something to be exploited and has been exploited within offices and backgrounds. There is not a silence to it, because if you're listening, but it could be a silence in that environment which you can use it. And so I think to argue as abstraction as something powerful it's something that is going to have to be tackled as kind of across the whole of everyone's minds as something so fixed into something kind of as wall art, or like just something that you can pick up from IKEA or something. That is kind of what you're liberating it from. And so I guess it's just the weight of that connotation which is what's heavy here.
Camila, I think I saw your hand.
Yes, I just wanted to add to Jana's reflection on the fact that, yes, abstraction as a way to vehicle a message, a political message, is scholarly has been scholarly investigated. But if we look, I also spoke about eccentric abstraction, in fact, but I was thinking to nowadays new practices and saying that abstraction is not still the main vehicle to express political messages. So I was thinking to contemporary scholarship in reality, not to studies related to, of course, a historical phenomenon or with the historiographic methods, of course. I was thinking of nowadays practices, to be honest. And for what I've learned from now, or for what I've studied for this paper, I found very few exhibitions too that related, contemporary exhibition, I precise again, related to abstraction as a vehicle for political messages. I found just 2 exhibitions held both in 2017 and last year, no, 2 years ago, 2012, also in US. For example, so maybe, yes, there is a deep comprehension of the topic from in the scholarship related to past media and past uses of media, but I've seen few studies, at least now, related to contemporary artistic practices related to abstraction and political messages. Just to add, just to complete your reflection.
Yeah, I just want to amend what with that. I want to like amend so it doesn't sound like I'm taking a meta perspective, because I should have identified when I was just thinking about abstraction in my proximity to David Getsy's scholarship, also what I was presenting in my paper and what I think sometimes Nairy Baghramian's work addresses is the history of European metaphysical abstraction in the context of modernism, because a part of that power was its comparative sucking in with a bunch of readily available ethnographic objects that presumably looked like cubes of the same kind. They were not, they were different cubes, right? So I want to say, I was thinking about metaphysics in the context embedded in histories that seem universalist, for the reasons that was said earlier, like when does abstraction become imbued with so much political power? I've encouraged everybody to just read some things people have written about Beethoven, because music has not always been a force for social good. But I think also your talk did a very wonderful job, Jana, of situating a group of people that are talking to each other and are dealing with a particular inherited understanding and potential reimagining of certain traditions of metaphysical modernist abstract, but also commercialized versions, different tributaries. So it's not just one big stream of abstraction. So I want to clarify that. So thank you.
I just wanted to add on what Camilla was saying. Just there is this new, very new movement to not very new, but as in the socially aware art or the socially active art. And it feels like it's kind of a message of this debate of the kind of, it's communication, and it's kind of how it's this message that you can either go, different angles at. And I think in general, with the pressure of kind of what art, whether figurative or abstract, can offer to general populace is I don't know, in England specifically, everything is being cut in that sector, and I'm sure it's the same across the world. So I think when you're trying to justify for money, maybe it's even harder to kind of persuade people of the communicative power of an abstraction. And people like things to be very direct. If you're trying to get a social message across, then you need it to be accessible. And I think because abstraction's been seen as this thing which is inaccessible, then it's not given to argue that it has the power to communicate such messages. It's something to persuade of.
I think you make the point that Jana was kind of getting at really well, because in that particular romantic capital art tradition of making Western art music ineffable to the masses, it was music's transcendental appeal to immediate perception. They were sense perceptible objects that were immediate. They had no mediation. They're mediated. They're aesthetic sense objects. So it's that power that does get imbued into the history of object lessons and kindergarten toys. It's that intellectual milieu streaming and many other things, but you're making that presentation really great, like packaging that really well, because I do think that Gordon thinks a lot about the politics of how ineffability is mediated, and also how mundanity as human bodies on Earth are mediated within that language of like the ineffable, but within a certain social political context.
For what I've seen, at least, I'm open to suggestions, and I need to investigate more the topic. But for what I've seen, also from the point of view of sculptures, I think that there is a lot of attention to the figurative style with an active message, political message, but with a paroxystic and paradoxical tone. For example, to sculptures of Kara Walker, or the sculptural versions of The Laughing Man of Yu and Minjun. I think that from a contemporary point of view, there is the majority of the studies are centered to this aspect of sculptures, but sculptures are still a secondary place in all this theorization. Most of all, for what I've seen, scholar studies are centered to the practice that India was talking about. So active practice, riots, or also symbolical strikes, things that hits directly the target. So there is also this new tendency in the last 2 decades of materializing the objects, the artwork, more the last 2 decades, to be clear. They just materialize the artworks and try to express the political and the social content through demonstrative actions, so performances in this case. So it just keeps the tendency of the 60s in this case of performance. It seems to keep going. Of course, during the last 2 years, there were less performative demonstration respect to the past. Now I'll stop with the social content of art.
This conversation also is making me think about, this kind of perhaps a cultural expectation that art about political subjects or art about identity should depict a body or depict a person or depict a minoritized subject. Baghramian talks about this, I think, in one of the interviews or one of the videos, where she says that, being a post-colonial subject and being a woman, people expected that I would make art about that, and expected that to be transparent in the formal, or what it might expect it to be transparent formally. And so, yeah, I think part of what I see as really valuable about the object lessons framework is to sort of to blow up this kind of 80s postmodern idea of representation that that we're still kind of up against, or that's still in the cultural soup.
What I think, what I enjoyed about how you group together the assemblages of people, trying to cleave out some moments where you could be with objects that would not be necessarily expressionist or exuberant or prolix, was not the origins of the praxis, the method. The last minute, I didn't make the connection that, because I was so I don't know if everybody ever gets in the hole where you just get a new thing in your research, because I was going back to something, and the object lessons are the historical precedent to the kindergarten objects. Pestalozzi was a teacher and collaborator of Froebel, and their ideologies are slightly different, but they are united in their collaboration, but also in their united rebranding against what Rousseau was doing in his education reforms. And they were used to, the original context, which is not necessarily at all, which is always important to remember how different things change. When you're in the hole, I didn't even make the connection that what Gordon Hall might have been employing at Dia Beacon in a talk about Amy Noble, the student of Joseph Beuys, was the same thing that I was thinking about. And you were writing the program before me, I knew what was going on. I didn't even look at it. I was in that bubble, but the history of that method is so intertwined with a pre-romantic, organicist, naturalist, nature philosophy, organicist worldview that really uses alchemy and all kinds of hybridized Neoplatonisms to center the human to the environment from a Eurocentric perspective of regeneration. And when I didn't articulate well, and I didn't want to get into dialectic about something that was me, not you, was that the metaphysics in the late antiquity context that I was trying to express, it's abstraction. And for not everybody, it was complex Greek harmonics. We don't have those sources, but I'm not going to get into it because it's probably going to bore everybody. Everyone's going to log off.
Hey, Frederick, I'm really sorry. We've got just
okay.
a couple of minutes, and I just wanted to give Jana, since your comments were addressed to her, or India, who has her mic open, just a chance for one or two more kind of comments to close it off.
All right. I'll send it to you.
I appreciate it.
I just wanted to say, going off what Jana was saying about the body and the performing body, and then what I remembered when you were saying at the start about what is virtual and what is real, and it was making me think that there's an interesting moment for photography here, but also just in general of our experience of our own bodies and kind of these concerns about moving into the post-human age. And kind of for the last 30 years or so, the kind of theories of the avatar, and the avatar is kind of a key method we all use to perform ourselves all the time, and it's kind of not entirely separate from us anymore. And so maybe moving forward and thinking about sculpture and photography, we'll also be having this layer of being separate from our bodies and using our phone as a extra thing, as an extra hand, and having completely non-human parts of ourselves as ourselves. And so maybe this centering of the body in relationship to sculpture won't be there forever. And so we might have to experience it beyond our bodies anyway, kind of thing.
Well, we could clearly go on with this, but that seems like actually that seems like a great place to end or to pause. And maybe this conversation becomes a kind of time capsule of a transitional moment and a moment of rethinking the body and its place in regards to sculpture and the image. Thank you, everybody. This has been a great pleasure. And I hope everybody will stay with us for our keynote address, which is coming up. Actually, I think right on the moment. I will go ahead and move to introduce our keynote speaker. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Miwon Kwon. the Walter Hopps Chair in Modern and Contemporary Art at the University of California, Los Angeles. Trained in architecture, Professor Kwon holds an MA in photography and has extensive curatorial experience from her tenure at the Whitney Museum of American Art in the 1990s. She received her PhD in architectural history and theory from Princeton University in 1998 and joined the faculty at UCLA in 1997. Her research and writings have engaged several disciplines, including contemporary art, architecture, public art, and urban studies. She was a founding co-editor and publisher of Documents, a journal of art, culture, and criticism, and serves on the advisory board of October magazine. In 2012, she co-organized a major historical exhibition entitled Ends of the Earth, Land Art to 1974 with Philipp Kaiser, which was on view at the Museum of Contemporary Art Los Angeles and traveled to Haus der Kunst in Munich that same year. The accompanying publication received the College Art Association's 2013 Alfred H. Barr Jr. Award for the year's most distinguished catalog. She's the author of One Place After Another, Site-Specific Art and Locational Identity, as well as essays on the work of many contemporary artists, including Michael Asher, Felix Gonzalez Torres, Christian Marclay, Ana Mendieta, Gabriel Orozco, and today, most recently, Nairy Baghramian. So thank you very much for joining us, Professor Kwon.
Thank you for having me. So I could tell from eavesdropping on the panel discussion of the symposium presenters that I've missed extraordinarily interesting papers. And there's a lot for, I think, me to learn from all your work. And I'm very excited and inspired with the issues around photography, politics, abstraction, the body that came up in the discussion. I only hope that the presentation today that I will provide can just add to another layer of appreciating Nairy Baghramian's work. I guess congratulations goes to her first for the honor of receiving the prize from the Nasher Center. I want to thank everyone at Nasher, Leah Arnold and her team, for both inviting me and coordinating the symposium. I also want to thank my friend and colleague, Philipp Kaiser, who co-curated that land art exhibition with me, one of the big personal and career highlights. Since he's now the director of the Marion Goodman Gallery, where Nairy shows, and Philip's the one that really almost strong-armed me into working on Nairy's work and to write something. It turned into the essay that was published as part of the exhibition catalog accompanying her show in 2021 called Side Leaps. Again, I hope that what I contribute here today can, synergize with everyone else's work, and I'll get started then. So I think everyone who's looked into Nairy's work knows the multimedia engagement she has, how kind of capacious her practice is, insofar as she engages with photography, with interior design, architecture, drawing, as well as language. I think she has an incredible feel for play with words. I think titling is part of that, but I think beyond that as well. My talk is not really engaging with those dimensions of her practice, but here exclusively focusing on the question of sculpture, which perhaps is appropriate since Nasher is a sculpture center. I'm going to share my screen now and hope all will work fine. this working fine? Can someone tell me? Everyone can see my screen? Okay, thank you. Okay, so working with the title Sculpture Notwithstanding on Nairy Baghramian's artistic pose. I heard the word pose come up during the panel discussion, so maybe it's going to take us further than beyond this text. So when I was working on researching for this assignment from Philip Kaiser to think about Nairy's work, I came across a video that Nairy made. Maybe others have seen it. It was made when she was a nomination candidate for the Hugo Prize Award 2020 for the Guggenheim Museum. It's on YouTube, so you can look it up. And it was almost a passing comment. Sculpture should have the chance to not fulfill expectations. It doesn't really roll off the tongue. It's a little awkward, but it struck me quite strongly. And it became a kind of starting off point to really dig into her vision, I guess one could say, in relation to the category of sculpture. I have noticed since I looked recently, and Marian Goodman's website is using this phrase a lot through Nairy's pages. I don't know if that had anything to do with that, but anyway. So more than 20 years into the 21st century, what expectations do we still have of sculpture today? Having surpassed the modernist paradigms of the first half of the 20th century, and having explored the postmodernist counter models of sculpture through the second half of the same century, it may sound anachronistic to raise such a question in 2021 and certainly in 2022. Are we not over sculpture really? Or at least over the question about its identity or its potential functions? Yet, despite the extent to which sculpture has been absorbed or has itself absorbed and has become hybridized in so many different ways, generating new categories and potentially mediums, and the word installation taking up it's a lazy word that takes up the task of embracing it all. Sculpture that's now intersecting with photography, with architecture, landscape design, video, performance, and film, and perhaps dance as well. All these myriad pursuits since the 1960s could be seen as declaring sculpture's dispersal, deconstruction, expansion, and perhaps even its death. Indeed, confirming the end of modernist sculpture and its values of autonomy, originality, universality, timelessness, etc. Despite all that, sculpture most definitely persists. This persistence, that is sculpture's continuing viability as both a lever and an arena for critical artistic questioning, has been the terrain of much of Nairy Baghramian's practice over the past 2 decades. The artist statement that I've quoted here to start the essay and also this lecture, that sculpture should be allowed. Sculpture should have the chance to not fulfill expectations, is to me a very provocative entreaty. It is significant that Baghramian's words do not refuse expectations or somehow elevate, extol refutation of expectation as itself a goal. This might be the case for some artists attached to the idea of a critical vanguard defined against or as in opposition to the established mainstream. It is also significant that while the option of failing or disappointing expectations is posed as potentially desirable here, failure and disappointment are not necessarily posited as positive critical values per se either. It's a rather ambiguous statement, in fact. Negation as a method, or in a sculptural method in particular for our case, is not exactly Nairy Baghramian's operational mode. In order to better understand the stakes animating her practice, we might ask, what are the new expectations burdening sculpture today? Or more precisely, what does the artist imagine to be the expectations burdening sculpture today, from which, very importantly, she would like to find some respite, to find rest, that is, that may be, or presumably, it would be in order to pursue sculpture further. Now, very generally speaking, this is me doing a quick art history lesson here. Very generally speaking, since minimalism, we expect sculpture to be more than a discrete, self-sufficient, three-dimensional object. Instead, we expect it to encompass a dynamic relay that coordinates between the art object, the viewing subject, and the spatial context of the object's public display. As such, we expect sculpture to have a relational, if not a choreographic sensibility, and be attuned to the architectural conditions of the exhibition space, as well as the potential movement of the viewer's bodies and their perceptual experiences, or as much as one could imagine that dimension. That we could imagine viewers engaging and moving through these spaces and objects in and through the space. Art historical discourse has also emphasized the extent to which such expanded rethinking of sculpture mid-20th century constructs a very different kind of self-reflexive viewer, no longer an abstract, disembodied monad, but grounded in a social, political, and historical matrix. The viewing subject's identity has come to matter more and more. Even though it should be emphasized that minimalism itself did not go very far in exploring this aspect of the triadic scheme of object, subject, and space/context. In fact, the viewing subject's gender, class, sexuality, ethnicity, age, histories, and race, and how these factors may influence the experience of a work of art was not addressed by minimalism hardly at all, even though it brought forward the very centrality of the viewing subject in the rethinking of sculpture. It may be a bit of a paradox, but of course the insistence on the specificity of the viewing subject's identity would kind of move forward, move on, and build into identity politics. And as we've inherited today, I think Jana mentioned something of this kind of phenomenon. Okay, we could come back to that if in the Q&A if anyone's interested to return to it. Since minimalism and then into process art and post-minimalism, we expect sculpture to be divested of a commitment to any obvious formal integrity or stable objective form. Sculpture is now expected to be an anti-form or a non-form that dissolves the simplified hard geometries and repetitive serial organization of minimalist objects. Focused on process and behavior of materials instead, and prioritizing the performative aspects of making rather than the final result, thus foregrounding the body of the artist in action more. Sculpture moves toward the temporal register, incorporating techniques of improvisation and embracing conditions of ephemerality, the transitory, and non-permanent. Sculpture here is a residue of actions, and here's another key figure from this paradigm of post-minimalism, Richard Serra's splashing work from the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art collection. It's collectible, in case you didn't know, redone in '95, originally from '69. So sculpture here is a residue of actions and energies impacting certain chosen materials in a given space, context, or situation, following certain procedures and parameters that may or may not be pre-planned, or not pre-planned in detail anyway, and that may or may not last into the future. Just as a side note, I've been super interested in works from this generation, 60s and 70s, that were thought to be one-offs, really, like the splashing piece, how an entire, set of practices that were thought to be uncollectible, unrepeatable, unreproducible, are actually finding new ways of being re-manifested in order to have a life that would last long into the future, as you see here. That may connect to things I will say later about site specificity, so you could kind of pin this issue here. So following post-minimalism and this move of sculpture's redefinition, we can perhaps pose institutional critique, assuming that we accept the positioning of institutional critique as part of sculpture's postmodern trajectory. I don't know that we have to, but let's do at this in this moment. Since institutional critique, the work of art is more pointedly interested in the institutional condition that is could be architectural, economic, social, political, ideological, that constitutes the artwork's presentation context. With this move, and here you see Michael Asher's rather famous canonic work of having removed a gallery wall so that the back activities of business and everyday maintenance and management is made continuous with the exhibition space that is usually kept separate and visually and physically and socially, and made into made visible as one continuous field. So with this move, we expect sculpture to encompass the context, to register its continuity or imbricated relationship with it in some meaningful way, and to serve as a mechanism to bring into view the literal and the figurative, the visible and the invisible, framing conditions around the artwork as the primary object of aesthetic consideration and critical attention. Now, notions of site specificity emerging from minimalism and developed through post-minimalist precedents coalesces in this path of sculpture's transformation, or at least that's the path that has been mapped out in contemporary art historical discourse on post-1960s sculpture and is now doxa, more or less. I've learned from that doxa and I've contributed to that doxa, and in many ways, I lean on it in order to enter Nairy's work, but I think it's up for questioning whether this sculptural trajectory of into the expanded field, borrowing Rosalind Krause's term, should also now be rethought, and maybe Nairy's work also provokes that kind of charge of potential need for rethinking. In any case, like many of her generation, Nairy Baghramian has inherited this history, this discourse, these expectations, and they determine to a large extent the ground against which her artistic choices and innovations find their legibility. Critic Andre Rotman, who has followed the artist most consistently over the past years, stated in 2008 that Baghramian's work recalled minimalism, post-minimalism, and institutional critique of the 60s and 70s. This is why I wanted to rehearse these three, in order to, quote, test their conventional limits and false promises, which is to say that Rotman sees Baghramian as being engaged in a kind of a critical review of these past sculptural paradigms or its legacy, and is questioning the inheritance. Just to further elaborate, Rotman is leaning on heavily in his assessment of Baghramian in 2008 on the work of my colleague here at UCLA, George Baker, who in assessing the works of artists such as Renee Green, Christian Philip Mueller, and Tom Burr, coined this phrase, meta-sculptural form, that is sculptures that are about other sculptures. So one might think of that as almost a kind of a modernist reflexivity, but I just wanted to acknowledge the work of George Baker here as a kind of another voice in this assessment about the status of sculpture in late 20th century into the early 21st. More recently than 2008, Andre Rotman, in response to Baghramian's temporary outdoor sculpture called Cold Shoulder from 2014, said, he extended his earlier thoughts and said, quote, "The artist has devised an even more radical synthesis of the fundamental parameters of her recent practice. That is, one, the morphology derived from the body, two, an explicit involvement of the viewer, and three, a reflection on the exhibition situation." And that she does this, a radical synthesis, in a poignant allegory of contemporary sculpture, end quote. And here, let me just offer, through Craig Owens' words, a work qualifies as allegorical when it renders the circumstances of its own genesis tangible in its appearance. Okay, these are rather large. That's a very poor image of a moment in the installation of these works, based on shoulder pads used in clothing and fashion. I just want to just point out that the object that she is drawing this form from are supplemental or supportive structures to amplify the body, to make it appear, to exaggerate the shape of shoulders in order to quote unquote give it more strength. I think I wanted to start with, or just posit this work in the talk, because I think some key central themes and concerns are evident here that we'll see again in other projects. So going back to Rotman, who sees Baghramian as this very important critical artist, kind of incorporating and resynthesizing these aspects of earlier paradigms of sculpture. I would contend that beyond Cold Shoulder, that his assessment actually can apply to almost all of Baghramian's recent series of works, including this Big Valve from 2016, Scruff of the Neck, pretty spectacular work from also 2016, Stay Downers, I think maybe one of my favorites, and A Breathing Spell from 2018, the work made out of glass and other resins and such, that all these works in some way, regardless of their differences in formal qualities or material selection or the spatial disposition at the time of installation, that all of these present, I think, or can be used as examples of what Rotman means about radical synthesis of those three qualities that I quoted. We could go into each of these works to, kind of unpack them, but I'll just, these are such weird works. Weird, but fascinating. Body parts that are attached to architecture that seems skin-like, epidermal, bone-like. In any case, kind of demonstrating a kind of mutual dependence, mutual supportive dynamic between work and given architecture. That too, this issue of supplemental structure or supportive dependence between element and context, we will see again. Okay, so we could go into one work anyway, one body of work. Scruff of the Neck, for example, is a suite of sculptures that take inspiration from dental prosthesis. So they kind of remind one of retainers or braces, bridges and implants, etc. They also, as an aside, remind me of like the weird shapes and things in Yves Tanguy's surrealist paintings. And there may be a connection there. But Scruff of the Neck, inspired by dental prosthesis, referencing the body in need of repair, again, support, or some kind of correction, could be a prime example of what Rotman is talking about as a radical synthesis. Comprised of bulbous, tooth-like forms in white plaster, some parts covered in beeswax or rubber that are fastened to irregularly shaped and unevenly surfaced metal plates in polished cast aluminum, which are in turn part of an armature made of polished aluminum rods that attach to the wall or ceiling. Here you see the attachments on the wall. Oh, here's a detail of the kind of the polished, lumpy, rough and not rough metal plates that are part of the sculpture here. Many of the sculptures in the series look like very strangely decorated flying buttresses, energetically projecting off of the architecture of the gallery into the viewer space. The ways in which Scruff of the Neck alludes to the body and introduces, one could say, humanized materials. The effort of the hand is visible in the treatment of natural and industrial materials throughout the work, while simultaneously exposing the work's construction. The bolts, washers, clamps, etc., all remain visible, and activating the space of the work's presentation. All these qualities combine to confirm Rotman and other critics' assessments that Baghramian sculptural works recall past generations' efforts to reveal their limits and to newly interrogate their sculptural aspirations, which is to say Baghramian's art seems actually to perfectly fulfill art world expectations of advanced sculptural practice today. That it is, there is an expectation of sculpture to invoke post-World War II legacy while critically revising, reversing, deferring, displacing, upending, or allegorizing this legacy for our contemporary moment. So she is actually fulfilling that expectation. Here's another view of ones that are actually leaning and against the wall rather than on the ceiling or projecting outward in a more dramatic way as the prior image. So in works like this, I think it's hard not to recall precedents from this earlier generation like Eva Hesse. And I think Hesse is a really key reference figure for at least a body of Baghramian's work, or in this case, Jupon Sospandu with earlier Hesse's work as well. So recalling the legacies, the earlier works, but resetting them in some way. That Baghramian's been recognized for being an excellent radical synthesizer. I like that term. Anyway, such a depth fulfillment of expectations regarding sculptural practice today returns us now to the intrigue of the epigraph at the beginning of this essay. Sculpture should have the chance to not fulfill expectations. So we need to ask about the nature of these expectations again. It might be expedient to look at Baghramian's works produced for outdoor settings, since sculpture placed in public locations beyond the relatively polite and regulated confines of indoor art galleries or museums contend with a broader range of expectations regarding its function and meaning. The artist's contribution to Sculpture Project Münster in 2007, Entr'acte, Intermission, is well known for the extreme state of its precarity and the marginality of its siting. Comprised of 3 large rectangular panels made of mostly white industrial fabric and set up like a folding screen in the middle of a parking lot near the central station in Münster, Entr'acte appeared to many viewers as a temporary and improvised structure dividing the space of its occupation, not unlike a makeshift barrier at a construction site. Its identity as an artwork escaped many passersby, given its seemingly unremarkable qualities. In fact, it was probably too familiar in relation to ordinary urban infrastructure objects. And even the sculpture suffered graffiti on its surfaces during the run of the citywide exhibition, which ran from June to September of that year in 2007. In contrast, for those viewers armed with knowledge of contemporary art, vocabulary of minimalism, post-minimalism, site specificity, appropriation, etc., Entr'acte's abstract, non-heroic, if not absolutely pathetic, physical presence, courting neglect, defacement, and even possible destruction, signals a bold challenge to more traditional expectations of public sculpture, which strive to represent or embody grand gestures of strength, stability, durability, hierarchy, permanence, and other transcendent ideals. Entr'acte, in failing to fulfill the traditional expectations of sculpture, or more popular expectations of sculpture, proposing what might be described as a faltering or impoverished model in comparison, satisfied other art world expectations by putting into question the extent to which even postmodern sculpture that are understood to be a challenge to established values, such as those by Richard Serra, still abide long-standing modernist expectations. Baghramian's Entr'acte is, in my mind, undeniably in dialogue with Serra's Tilted Arc, the site-specific public sculpture in New York City that comprised a corten steel wall of 120 feet long by 12 feet high, cutting across this Federal Plaza site upon which it was installed, dramatically cutting the plaza in half, or spatially bifurcating it. As is, I'm sure, well known to all art history students, following an intense controversy, Tilted Arc was removed from its location in 1989, which Serra declared was synonymous with the destruction of the work. So Serra's artistic assertion of an anti-monument that declares its own monumental antagonism, as well as his insistence on his sculpture's permanence, very much informs Baghramian's Entr'acte and probably some other projects as well. So in that contrast between Serra and Baghramian, all the formal qualities, all the treatment of the space, etc., I think we can begin to glean a very different kind of program and a position about sculpture, especially in the public space. Baghramian's vision of sculpture. Now, 10 years later, in 2017, Baghramian returned to Münster with a pair of sculptures for the 5th iteration of Sculpture Project. Although this time her sculptures were made of physically stable materials considered more suitable for public sculpture, that is bronze and metal and lacquer paint, and were placed at the very heart of the citywide exhibition and not in some like marginal traffic zone or a parking lot. Premier sighting of her work was in the front and back courtyards of the 18th century Baroque palace, Erbdrostenhof. Baghramian's contributions seem like incomplete works again, despite these material changes and location shifts. Part of the series, Privileged Point, the darkly painted sculpture in the forecourt was horizontally oriented, tubular form that looked like a scaled up and buffed up version of either a casually drawn notational line or a thinly rolled out pastry dough in the shape of an incidental doodle. The thick coat of paint covering the sculpture was left to coagulate into irregular scallops on the underside, as you see here, almost like spikes in certain areas, as if someone had missed the timing on cleaning off the viscous paint material, which would have given, if this scalloping and this kind of force of gravity was not visible in the work, the sculpture would have had a much different feel, of course. It would have had a slicker finish, and it would have been an erasure of the status of the paint as an additive coating if we didn't have those markers here. Not quite a circle. The open form of privilege points disallowed any clear delineation of front and back or interior exterior, occupying the space of the forecourt only to demarcate it without forcefully announcing its objecthood or asserting a heroic presence, as had been done in the same exact spot by Richard Serra again in 1987, just before his tilted arc came down. I think he meant this site specifically insofar as the curve of these two cortensial plates are taken from the curve of the building facade, but of course kind of positioned to be facing inwards and articulating the axiality of the front entry here, but monumental in any case. So this was how that site was treated by Serra in '87, and then this is in 2007. This is when Enfact was installed by Baghramian by the train station. So not quite a circle, open form of privilege points. Didn't have the kind of clarity of form or spatial orientation as Serra or Siegmund's work in this very same spot in earlier sculpture project Münster. Moreover, the sculpture's diminished capacity to hold its shape, to stand on its own without potentially collapsing into a pile of pieces, was underscored by sizable clamps holding the parts together, which you see very clearly here. You can sort of see the demonstration of the holding together as really part of the work. As you see, this is 3 separate pieces and they don't quite connect. And the connection is provisional with a supplemental support structure again here. So these clamps are propping the work off the ground as if to make plain the sculpture's inability to be autonomous, making visible its need for assistance and support, quite literally. The clamps also introduced a sense of ambiguity as to whether the sculpture was completed, whether it was fully realized, or if the installation was actually still in progress. Now, further exacerbating this ambiguity, Baghramian's work, her contribution was two separate pieces in coordination with each other. So Baghramian's work in the back courtyard of the palace consisted of a pile of pieces. They're primed in white, waiting for paint to come, and they're strewn about, waiting for some assembly to come. The parts that could or would become another rendition, or potentially two, of privilege points were presented in their unfinished, not ready for prime time state, prepared and ready to be pulled together and completed, but not yet. So here's a view of it standing with your back to the palace, and this is looking back toward the palace. And given that each privilege point, or if the one in the forecourt, the blue one, which you see through the building out the other side in this photograph, you could imagine you could make two privilege points with 6 separate pieces here. Now the co-presence of the spatial relay, or the co-presence or the spatial relay between the two versions of privilege points in the front and back courtyards of the palace, and the simultaneous historical relay between Baghramian sculptures and those of the past on the same site, brought to the fore the expectations that attach to sculptures in the context of Sculpture Project Münster. That is, this city-based exhibition, which happens every 10 years, focusing on sculpture in public places. This exhibition project has been an international showcase for site-specific art since its inception in 1977. These are past catalogs, and every year, every 10 years, we have this return to the question of sculpture, and also specifically site-specific sculpture with Sculpture Project Münster. This is the latest iteration, and we have one hopefully coming up in 27. While not all exhibited works over the decades would qualify as site-specific, insofar as artists are invited to visit the city, to choose a site, and then to produce or present a work in response to their chosen site, Sculpture Project Münster continues to be a major venue for the exploration of the artistic potential and cultural politics of site specificity. Importantly, in addition to this base premise of the exhibition, is the fact that a few select works from each exhibition are permanently retained through purchase or long-term loans, securing the specific art-site relationship or that bond in perpetuity for a small number of the exhibited works. So Baghramian's presentation of privilege points in 2017 needs to be understood as a critical response to these pre-existing conditions, which provoke a range of certain and uncertain expectations. It's a, again, I think there's traces of minimalism, post-minimalism, and institutional critique in this project, I think. Now, on one hand, her work emphasized the impermanence of site-specific art already, not only in the physical aspects of her sculptures and their disposition, emphasizing precarity, disassembly, not readiness, etc., but also its relationship to the site of Erdrossenhof Palace as undoubtedly temporary and provisional. In doing so, Baghramian called into question the prevailing claims of site specificity that still assumes permanence as an essential defining condition. Here again, I think Richard Serra's famous dictum that to move a site-specific work is to destroy it is clearly implicated. Yeah, I think this is an interesting side story to maybe think about in relation to privilege points, and that, as I noted, I think Sarah did produce thinking that it's site-specific or conceptualizing as such as it has a direct relationship to the architecture of the site. But apparently because it was so unpopular at Münster in terms of the citizens, the effort to purchase and make this permanent was rejected. So it got taken down. So I don't know if he would consider it also the work was destroyed. But it gives you the grounds for the kind of questioning that one continued to have to insist on about this issue of permanence and long-term duration, and somehow that as a fundamental aspect of the definition of site-specific sculpture. So just underscoring that with Baghramian's work, she is, I think, already emphasizing impermanence of site-specific art on one hand. On the other hand, Baghramian's unfinished privilege point, like here, especially in the back courtyard, is a rather pragmatic response, not at all like a high-minded critical position, but really just practical in order to address the uncertainty of the future of the work, deferring the labor and cost involved in finishing the work until its final destination is determined through a purchase. So why make the sculpture when it's not going to stay here? To postpone all the costs and labor to a later point when its site will be found or will be determined and confirmed. In this move, I see the artist acknowledging the non-specificity of the work's relationship to its physical site in Munster. At the same time, she also reveals that the sculpture's potential identity as a site-found work in Munster or elsewhere, and I think she is positing this as potentially into the category of site-specific sculpture and not just about her work, that she's revealing that the sculpture's potential identity as a site-bound work is a matter tied up with arts economics, bringing market factors into the conceptual framework of privilege points, which is to say, Baghramian asserted that site-specific art today is more commonly practiced as site-adjustable, problematically in many instances, and contrary to, or in the name of specificity, it's constantly adjusted. And that this reality of site adjustability of sculpture and the pressures that define it should be acknowledged and more accurately understood. Now, I have spoken elsewhere about the ways in which site-specific is pervasively used for, or rather misused in contemporary art today to describe works that are in fact not at all site-specific, holding on to the idea that site-specific is a one-time deal. My notion of site-adjustable as distinct from site-specific was first presented in a symposium paper at the Guggenheim on the occasion of a James Turrell exhibition. Some of you might remember it was in 2013. And he's a prime example of someone who practiced site adjustability, but is described his work as always site-specific. So the term site adjustability, which I'm proposing, in fact, is to point to how siteless conditions have returned to or have maybe always been with site-specific art practice. We don't fully recognize it and we don't acknowledge it even. I mean, to the extent that everyone just uses the shorthand term site-specific, but actually the conditions of how those works live in the world, like that Richard Serra splashing piece, is a territory that I think we have to contend with, but it remains quite obscured. But I think in a project like this with privilege points, Baghramian is drawing attention to it somewhat elliptically, I think, and perhaps ambivalently, I might want to say, but it's not being occluded in the practice. Let me just share with you where these sculptures have gone. So Privilege Points following Sculpture Project Munster was presented in SF MoMA. And Walker Art Center, Minneapolis. And you'll note right away that these newer versions do not have the clamps, and they're not in the, kind of the disjointed parts as they were at Munster. And here's in Luxembourg, they become indoor sculptures. Yeah, I think quite interesting and beautiful. So challenging expectations in these ways propels Baghramian's ongoing engagement with sculpture. As such, the proposition that, quote, sculpture should have the chance to not fulfill expectations is in fact to continuously question expectations, not only the kind that are shaped by entrenched traditions and dogma, but also those that have emerged in opposition or resistance to them, by which I mean the kind of post-60s, postmodern sculptural practices as well. In some ways, though, Baghramian's probing of expectations about sculpture goes even further to more fundamental beliefs that sustain sculpture as such. In a 2020 publicity video, which I referred to already in relation to the Hugo Boss Prize, Baghramian speaks of sculpture through the language of dance. Oh, here's when it becomes a gallery object. This is Marion Goodman Gallery. Oh, I wanted to ask, I think, India about her comments about abstraction and corporate culture, and whether galleries like Marion Goodman or Gagosian or David Zorner, how they would be positioned in relation to corporate culture. Okay, but that's an aside. Okay, so Baghramian speaks of sculpture through the language of dance. Exceeding the common association of sculptural objects with human bodies in search of an even deeper anthropomorphic insight, she says, quote, and I put it on the screen here, to take a pose is in itself a temporary state that needs the act of releasing to be able to formulate or form the next pose. You need a rest, at least to release the joints. The act between the two poses, that uncertain moment of contemplation, captures my full attention. To get out of any kind of static mechanism and frozen poses and rethink our position seems to be an important part of thinking further about our societies in general. So the whole idea of the poses and releasing the poses is actually to re-question, that is to question the question. That's how I would translate that. To re-question every time our position and not to get stiff. Okay. So we can perhaps recognize the term pose as likely alluding to sculpture in that quote as a static or frozen state of a body. And the task of finding possibility of new poses to be able to formulate other or alternative forms is clearly imbued with sociopolitical significance for the artist also. But the artist says the pose is actually temporary and that the activity between poses is what captures her full attention. That is the state of not posing, releasing the body, letting it rest. That is, let it have downtime. One could also say this in-between poses is trying not to hold the communicative position. That is, that's another way one could think about the pose, right, is as a communicative position. That is Baghramian is not only conceptualizing sculpture here within a temporal and performance framework that is in the language of movement or bodies in space or as a kind of passage, but in doing so, trying to redefine sculpture as the state in between poses. That's a provocation that, you know, really kind of tweaks your brain, I think. In the same video, the artist puts it this way, quote, "The moment of resting and taking the pressure off or pressure up, it could happen through the making in sculpture." So sculpture not as a pose, but the recuperative state before and after the pose, or poses, because it's always in a continuum. Sculpture as the respite that allows for the upholding of temporary poses. Again, sculpture as not so much representing rest, but as a state of rest. What could we expect from such a sculpture? I don't know, but one of the most recent works is this. And I think informed by the kind of thinking that I've just shared with you, Knee and Elbow, which is an outdoor sculpture here made of marble and steel. The marble's been, you know, kind of treated in a way that conjures pockmarks or skin or flesh of some kind. And these joints are that are made of steel are visible, and the parts are again kind of disconnected and held together in like the work that we saw before at Münster. I'm not sure if I want to propose that this is fulfilling this kind of sculpture that is not a pose, that is a sculpture that is at state of rest. But given that the artist has realized this work in the midst of these thoughts, it, you know, invites one to think about it in those terms. I think what's interesting is the clamps and the support structures that were external before in both the sculpture project at Münster, as well as the breathing spells, the glass pieces that were attached to the walls, where the armature, the support structure was always kind of externalized in prior sculptures. In this case, we're seeing them kind of internal to the sculpture. She makes that visible, so we understand that there is support inside. Perhaps it's borrowing on the human body, the bone and flesh, you know, combination. But I think in terms of a move within sculpture, I think that's interesting. It seems quite a departure. And I do think it's informed by her engagement with dance quite literally, and the work of Maria Hasabi in particular. This is a still from a performance that was a kind of a collaborative project with Baghramian, which I won't go into really here, but there's a rhyming between Knee and Elbow and this, certainly kind of shared lessons. To extrapolate further as a way to conclude, to extrapolate further from the artist's words, one could imagine that such a sculpture, that is one that is in between poses, would be allowed to take a break from the effort and the pressure and the burden, maybe even pain of maintaining an upright body. It would be allowed to refuse the state of being freestanding in all senses of that term, understood materially, symbolically, and politically. And I do want to forward that Baghramian's art, and certainly not just exclusive to her, but I do think art speaking in symbolic languages or abstract languages can very much be thought of as models of a political position, political outlook, even if it's not picturing a political content. This was brought up in the panel, so I wanted to underscore that here. And this is what I'm getting at with these final thoughts. So going back, let me reread myself. To extrapolate further from the artist's words, one could imagine that such a sculpture would be allowed to take a break from the effort, the pressure, the burden, maybe even pain of maintaining an upright body. It would be allowed to refuse the state of being freestanding in all senses of that term, understood materially, symbolically, and politically. Instead of having to insist on, or to represent, or to embody independence, detachment, singularity, isolation, even heroism, such sculpture would be allowed to admit to its many dependencies. And site specificity could be rethought along these lines of dependencies. Such a sculpture would not need to hide its weaknesses, vulnerabilities, fatigue, or its need for support and supplementation. It would seek attachments and rely on connections. It will have a chance and the space to concede its lack of wholeness and confess its need to be in relation with other things. It will be happy to lie down, all the while accepting that nothing can be forever, rather than building on the notion of freestanding, which is a foundational attribute of inherited notions of sculpture. Baghramian's art proposes new expectations for sculpture: to stand with standing, perhaps even not standing, all understood materially, symbolically, and politically. Thank you. The end.
Thank you so much for your talk, Miwon. This was such a great way to cap off this week. And I do think if you're willing, we have time for a couple of questions.
Sure. I did try to mark places where I thought some of the conversation I overheard during the moderated panel might have a relation, connection. But I'm happy to just take questions as well.
Well, actually, the questions I have initially come from participants in the symposium. So
okay.
actually, they've put them in the chat to me, but I would also invite them if those of them who would like to, if you want to turn on your cameras, if you'd like to turn them back on, you can ask your questions directly. I can also read them to her as you would like. So
it's so freaky, just seeing a square of all these like names, and
yes.
I'm like, hello, is anyone out there? But,
exactly, and
we're all in the same boat,
and me ventriloquizing other people's questions. So Jana, if you had put in a question, so if you want to start.
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Kwon. So nice to meet you.
Hi.
Your work. I was thinking as you were talking and having read your essay before, and even thinking about my own paper, I think the scholarship has put Baghramian's work pretty squarely within this genealogy of minimalism, post-minimalism, site specificity, institutional critique. And, I think the more that I hear that, the more it sounds very, for lack of a better word, provincial to me. It's very US centric, very New York centric. And I was just thinking, sort of given the global perspective that you took in the land art show, if there's any ideas, offhand that come to you to try to think about, like, is this work being asked to be placed in a more local context in terms of Berlin or, in Europe in general, or is it asking for like a global context, and what are there terms within sort of like a globalist art history, which is problematic in many ways, paradigm that we might try to sort of realign this genealogy.
Yeah, I think the work of realigning the genealogy, as you put it, is upon us, and that we have to tackle it. I'm not sure exactly what paths can cut through that. I think one could be, the kind of relativizing of that genealogy within the global frame. One would, I think, have to be careful about, just as art history has tried to contend with the different historicities and temporalities and chronologies around even modernism, as it impacts different parts of the world and how they manifest very differently in different contexts. I think it would be the same dealing with this kind of genealogy. In writing this essay, if I felt that Nairy was not self-consciously engaging with that genealogy, it would be totally problematic that I would put her there, or I would have critiqued Rotman even further. And my own, a little discomfort in further putting her there was felt as I was writing. But it's not outside of her practice. I think it does really inform her practice. I think it's on the horizon for how she's pursued her work. So, I give myself the excuse that it's okay. But I think I don't have an answer, but maybe a set of concerns or questions. Having acknowledged that the genealogy does have to be critiqued and further relativized, is to go back to a comment you made during the panel around identity politics and abstraction. And the ways in which certain artists of certain identities, backgrounds, get positioned to be, whether they like it or not, kind of representative of certain regions or certain cultural traditions. And I think abstraction and even this genealogy offers certain artists like Nairy not to get pigeonholed that way, that this is the alternate history or the alternate trajectory of sculpture, and it represents this place or this tradition. And I think we're in a moment of, the forces of, globalization, I hate that word, but that puts so much more on the table for us to have to put in relation, contextualize, relationally and differentially define. But it could set up a trap also for particularizations as a kind of value, which may or may not be in certain contexts. So, but my turn to dance for thinking about Baghramian or Nairy turning to dance herself, and thinking about the body in relation to choreography, rhythm, and things like this. I think very broadly speaking, and this also comes through the work of my graduate students, is dance is super important for me to think about in relation to post-60s art history generally. That minimalism comes out of dance. It doesn't come out of Robert Morris gets it out of dance props and Simone Forti, right? So getting a fuller understanding of already the presence of moving bodies in the discourses that we have inherited that excluded it, that's part of the revision of the genealogy that I'm interested in, that's maybe different than perhaps the globalization move, but that's one aspect that I'm interested in. And to the extent that Nairy is a expat, right? She's Iranian, but German, and, US and all that. And my own experience of identity politics from the 90s, the multiculturalist moment, and how have like in your own physique having the signs of a difference and how that positions you. Like I'm very resistant to collapsing or work in relation to the identity of the artist and their background. So for me, like abstraction or more hybridized languages, visually or otherwise, that exceed easy placement are super valuable politically and needs to be, I think, pursued that way or nurtured that way. So that's about all I got on that. I think it's maybe your generation, my students, who are going to take up the charge of needing to like destabilize the kind of the entrenched doxa, as I say, of and we're doing it actually in my seminar this quarter at UCLA too, like looking back at institutional critique and really realizing that there's no real cohesive body of practice there. It's really just what art history has been saying to itself over and over again, you know? So if you just like return to the works, then there's something so much more and more complex and rich to draw out of rather than these. But I end up doing the PAT thing, you know, the genealogy, and that's part of, and this is maybe outside of the maybe more self-reflexive in terms of art historical methodologies, especially around contemporary art, is the practice and the protocols around writing of these kinds of essays. And as you guys talked about already in your panel, I think I've met Nairy, but I've only seen one work in person, and especially sculpture. I mean, I think it was fascinating to me that you guys talked a lot about photography and other media, video, and the importance of taking those, let's say, supplementary or secondary documentary materials seriously as part of the construction of the practice. I would agree with that. But I still get very attracted to sculpture because of its insistence that it's a presence and that you should, like, one would, you know, expect you to contend with it as a presence with your presence, you know. But the field is not organized with those values. So, yeah, the irony is that site-specific art, I write about it, but it's very hard for me to experience it in person. You would need a lot of money to travel to those locations and be part of that circle that, you know, can do that. But anyway, I'm veering off. Thank you for the question. I think that the answers to the question about the set genealogies and how to contend with them, I really look to learn from you guys.
Thank you. Yeah,
I'm working on it quietly on, you know, on the side.
Yeah. I also really appreciated what you said about them being, you know, those moments being important too, and being actively kind of engaged by the artist, you know, rather than, I mean, I wouldn't expect you to just do sort of a pat rundown if there wasn't a good justification. So. Thank you.
I'm always interested in how art history is doing its work, like how art historical discourse is constructing the narrative. So I don't know if that came through in the essay, but I think I'm rather neutral about what Rotman says about Baghramian's work. But I track that in order to kind of show internal to my text how she's being constructed, right? And yeah, I'm always kind of fascinated by the work of the art discourse. And when I get assignments like this, it's almost like I have to undo or read across the grain of what's been said about the artist and how they're already like positioned. And Nairy's up there, you know, she's up there. Well, she's got the Nasher Prize, but you have to take that in as much as like, what is the work, and imagine your encounter with the work, you know. So I feel like you have to do double work in dealing with contemporary art.
And the legacies. Oh, sorry. Just that the legacies of that moment are so formative now in the academy too. So it's like, it's still a cultural object to contend with, as like we also start to like dismantle or reimagine the canon.
Yeah, and the authors of those claims are still alive. So you could like jeopardize your career if you go too far. Sorry, that's very like, you know, crass and pragmatic what I just told you.
Well, actually, Jana, thanks for that question. Yeah. That was really productive. And since we're talking about crass real world things, I think I would like to come back to Miwon, a comment you had made in your talk about one of the other comments in the roundtable, a comment from India about corporate culture. And I just wonder if you would like to return to that and ask India about it directly.
Well, I'm not sure if I could formulate succinctly or coherently, but let me take a stab. I was just very intrigued by the exchange that happened around abstraction and politics. And India, you seem to position abstraction capacity for, let's say, political efficacy or social anything has been totally colonized by the corporate culture. They've kind of neutralized any capacity for that. And that somehow, you know, is there a way to wrest it out of that context? Or I'm not sure if I'm remembering, you know, the way you characterize it. You put it much better. But my question is really about entities like Marian Goodman and commercial galleries of a certain scale that's quite dominant in the contemporary field now. I mean, they really sometimes are eclipsing museums in terms of exhibitions that they could put on, art projects they could sponsor and commission and have artists realize them, things like this. So there's not a very precise question here, but if there's a sector of society that we're kind of like calling corporate, that has utilized potential artistic / political capacities of art production and kind of domesticated it. And in that realm, where should we position like art galleries of a certain scale? I mean, they're basically a business, right? They're so let me throw it back at you and see if you can make sense of what I just said.
Yeah, I guess it's definitely not ruined the capacity to do such a thing, but I think it's definitely taking it back a few steps maybe. And I think in terms of the gallery space, I think whether it's good or bad, there is a definite power to the kind of layers of the expected gallery behavior. And I guess if it's a question of communication, then it's going to be about the setting. And I guess what really started this thought was I read this amazing article years ago, and I can't remember who it was by, but it was on the work of Calder, Alexander Calder, and I started researching it because I realized he had this work in the Spanish Pavilion at the Paris World Fair in 31, 36 or something like that. Anyway, in the 30s. and it just seemed crazy to me that this American guy was in the Spanish Pavilion during the Civil War. Okay, it must have been 36 or 37. And then it just traced the kind of lineage from where we see Calder in the 80s or the 70s as kind of his work were in the offices of big banks in New York. But actually at the start, his abstract forms were part of the Popular Front government in the Spanish Civil War. And, you know, after time, it kind of got released that he was being tracked by certain parts of the government and things like that. So that it does seem like there was a definite change in the way, just even through this case of Calder, that abstraction was separated from this political side that it actually was born with. You know, that's how it actually started. It's not that it doesn't have it. It's been kind of taken away over a long period of time. So I guess there's a lot going on, but the gallery probably also has to be a major part of changing that. And I think when
you mean changing the fact that there's a lost history to the political context and origins of his early abstraction, that the gallery should be responsible for that legacy not disappearing completely.
I guess, yeah, that could be one way of doing it for sure. And I think especially with the communication side, is the gallery, again, is what you expect, as you were saying, and what Nairy was saying, it's what you expect the gallery to fill in that gap between the seeing and the understanding. If you walk into a space and you see an abstract shape, but you're expecting to read about it and then get it, then there's different layers of this expectations. So if we're expecting it to come from the gallery, that also changes it. So it's where you expect your answer from the abstraction, I guess. And it's the same with the symbolism, as you were saying. It's kind of a same kind of thing, and its lack of direct communication, I guess. So I'm not sure how to solve it exactly, but I think, yeah, it's a question of the how we communicate, and yeah, I think being aware of the origins of it is super helpful, and kind of,
yeah, I guess maybe my curiosity is a bit more flat-footed and dumb than the thinking that you've put into this already, which is how to think about these galleries vis-a-vis the corporate culture, maybe broadly put, because how did, for instance, the Calders end up in Chase Manhattan Bank offices or whatever? I mean, the dealers made that happen.
Yeah.
So I think my dumb question to myself ultimately is are the apparatuses of this level of gallery organization really just an extension of the corporate culture? They go out and look for things to decorate people's offices, or they really are extensions of the artists or extensions of the art discourse? And I know the answer is not like, this black and white on that. But they certainly aren't divorced from the kind of corporate culture that also are their clients. It's more of a question, I guess, that goes to my wanting to understand what it means to be asked to write an essay by Mary Goodman Gallery for a show of Nairy Baghramian, whose work I like, but how am I being positioned within that machinery? And who, what purpose does this serve? is where this question's coming from. It's a very self-reflexive one that's really about the work of the art historian who has certain cultural capital, you know, as a scholar, and how that's getting mobilized within this kind of financially framed set of processes, you know. I know it's contributing positively to the discourse on Nairy. She liked the essay. I mean, I wonder what would have happened if she didn't like the essay. Could have killed the essay. But those are the realities that people in academia are also, you know, facing. We're not detached from this marketplace and the economic and ecological dynamics of all these kind of sectors and players and such. So I was just curious how, in your imagination, maybe your whole group, like where the gallery fits, or whether you think of it. I mean, I was impressed by the extent to which you guys all were very sensitive to how you are accessing information to the works, whether it's through photography, the internet search, and the lack of direct accessibility as a kind of a reality. And I'm wondering whether in that recognition is also the understanding of the institutional structures that, you know, the media structure, the gallery structure that organizes that, you know what I mean? I mean, like I said, it was a kind of a dumb question.
I don't think it was at all, because I think, I mean, as somebody who works in a museum, it's also, these are real professional questions that we don't often get a chance to talk about very often or think about. And I think the work has, and what we've done the last few days here, brought them to the fore very productively. We still have a few questions, but we've gone quite considerably over time. And I really appreciate everybody's patience and staying with us and staying engaged with us. Miwon, thank you for a wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you for the opportunity to like voice this essay, because, you know, like that's better than just having it in a nice catalog. So I really appreciate it. And Leah, I think you're still listening. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I think there's a celebration planned, right, for the Nasher Prize later in the year. Maybe we'll get to travel then.
Exactly. The beginning of April. So we will all try to see if we can get together in person or virtually again, or see what is possible. But It's been great to spend time with all of you virtually this week, and for everybody who has joined us on Vimeo. Thanks very much. And
thank you. Good luck, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.